Yes, I'm Alden, and I'll be presenting on behalf of my team. Yeah, I feel like this is very relevant, especially given the last topic. Should follow nicely. So there were a few questions we hope to tackle this work. Primarily, how has DNS resolver security evolved over time? And what is the current state today? We can start answering the first few questions just by looking at historical events, such as the ones shown on the right. To get a fuller picture, though, you need to dig deeper into the actual behavior of DNS resolvers. So we attempt to do just that by looking at what security and privacy practices can be observed from the perspective of the root server. So there are 6 security and privacy practices which should be considered in this work. First being transaction ID and source port randomization. These could be seen as the first line of defense against cache poisoning attacks. If these two values are randomized, an attacker would need to successfully guess both of these in order to poison a cache, giving up to 32 bits of entropy. 0x20 encoding is a technique proposed after the Kaminsky disclosure as an added defense against cache poisoning attacks. The basic idea is if a resolver randomizes the capitalization of the domain name and the capitalization it receives in response doesn't match that, it can reject the response. This adds additional bits of entropy, 1 per letter in the domain name, making the attacker's task exponentially more difficult. Notably, this technique was never standardized, but it is used by some modern resolvers, so we still consider it. DNSSEC adds cryptographic signatures to ensure integrity. There are 2 sides to DNSSEC deployment by authoritative servers and deployment by resolvers. Notably, here we just consider the deployment by resolvers. Next, DNS cookies. These add 64 bits of additional transaction security and are a mechanism for resolvers and servers to mutually authenticate. Finally, QNAME minimization is a privacy-preserving technique. The basic idea is that a resolver should only include the labels that are needed for the next step in the resolution process. Our data came from DIDL collections, Day in the Life, an annual 48-hour collection of traffic received at the root servers, sponsored by OARC. We specifically looked at traffic received at a root from 2008 to 2021. So now onto our results. First, we look at source port randomization. There are actually 3 classes of poor source port randomization that we detected. The first being no port variation at all. This would be the clearest case. Second, we looked for resolvers with a small source port pool, such as a resolver that randomly determines a set of ports at startup and alternates between these. And finally, we looked for resolvers that selected ports sequentially. So there were a few key points of interest we observed. In 2008, half of resolvers lacked source port randomization, accounting for 75% of queries. This was the year of the Kaminsky disclosure. It took 3 years after the Kaminsky disclosure for the fraction of vulnerable resolvers to half in size. And then finally, in 2021, 4% of resolvers lacked adequate source port randomization. And these resolvers accounted for 3% of traffic that we analyzed and are distributed across nearly 10,000 autonomous systems. This is one number we'd really hope to be a lot lower, as like Kaminsky showed 15 years ago, without source port randomization, cache poisoning can be reliably achieved in seconds. These resolvers map to 217 countries with the average percentage of vulnerable resolvers at the national level at 4.9. One country, which I'll leave anonymous, leads with 37% of its resolvers lacking adequate source port randomization, a fact we were able to successfully disclose to their CERT organization. Next, transaction ID randomization. Fortunately, here we observed a smaller rate of vulnerable resolvers. In 2021, only 2% of resolvers lacked adequate transaction ID randomization, though these resolvers only accounted for 0.44% of the traffic analyzed. You may note that there is a high fraction of small TXID pool in 2009 and 2010. While small source port pool makes some sense, the same cannot be said for transaction IDs. After some deeper inspection, we found that one element that many of these resolvers had in common was multiple MX requests made with a transaction ID of 10. There was almost no such resolvers in 2008, and it drops pretty quickly after 2009. Our best guess is that there was a bug introduced into some DNS resolver software some time between the 2008 and 2009 collections, and the data suggests that this bug was later corrected in its diminishing presence. And the data is a result of administrators applying the patch or upgrading. Now for DNSSEC, to detect resolvers using DNSSEC, we look for those requesting at least one DS key or DNS key record. Deployment of DNSSEC validation has been slow. There was no significant deployment of DNSSEC validation until 2013, 3 years after the root zone was signed and made publicly available. In 2021, 17% of resolvers appeared to be validating, accounting for 70% of queries analyzed. This is actually an encouraging data point. It appears that DNSSEC validating resolvers, though relatively few in number, produce a disproportionately large volume of traffic. Now for 0x20 encoding, I'll refer you to the paper for the full technique we used to detect this, but at a high level, you'd expect the ratio of uppercase to lowercase letters to be close to 50%. Overall, we found very minimal usage of this. 2021 was the year with the greatest percentage of resolvers using it, 0.4%. Given that this was never standardizing, it's perhaps unsurprising that so few resolvers using it. However, this small percentage does produce a disproportionate number of queries. In 2021, this 0.4% produced nearly 2% of the queries analyzed. For cookies, we look for resolvers that sent at least one query with a cookie. We start our analysis for cookies in 2016, the year the specification was published. The percentage of DNS resolvers supporting cookies has steadily increased since then, ending with 8% of resolvers and making 8% of queries in 2021. Now for QNAME minimization, to detect this, we looked for resolvers whose entire query sample consisted of one label or one label with underscore. Less than 5% of resolvers exhibited QNAME minimization behaviors prior to 2019. Coinciding with its adoption by Bind, a clear uptake in resolvers using QNAME minimization is shown starting in 2018, reaching 12% by 2021. Up until now, we've only discussed each of these techniques in isolation of the others. We now consider the interactions between these different security mechanisms. For example, we consider the possibility that a resolver lacking source port randomization is protected by a different mechanism. For the sake of the brevity, we only consider this for the 2021 dataset, the most recent data. I won't discuss each of these rows in depth, but some merit being highlighted. The most common stance was to use transaction ID and source port randomization, but none of the other mechanism, a stance employed by 59% of the resolvers. The next most common stance is to use transaction ID and source port randomization and DNSSEC, a stance used by 13.6% of resolvers. Encouragingly, these resolvers produce a disproportionate volume of traffic. Over half of all the traffic to a route comes from these resolvers. This speaks to one of the benefits of centralization. As big players adopt secure practices, all of their clients receive this benefit. The same can be said for big players with insecure practices, but fortunately we don't see evidence of that here. We now turn our attention to resolvers that have particularly problematic combinations of missing security mechanisms. Discouragingly, the vast majority of these resolvers, or of resolvers without source port randomization, also do not deploy any other security mechanisms considered, with the exception of transaction ID randomization. There are some resolvers with inadequate security practices across the board, including transaction ID randomization. Interestingly, 7 of the top 10 domains requested by these resolvers are for domains relating to voice over IP. In fact, 75% of the recorded queries from these resolvers are for VoIP domains, as opposed to only 0.01% of resolvers collectively. So our best theory for these resolvers is that it has something to do with a bug in a software related to voice over IP. So in conclusion, Basic DNS resolver security mechanisms are not ubiquitously deployed. To this date, significant portions of vulnerable resolvers continue to be inadequately protected by the security mechanisms we considered. The ideal would be to have all resolvers behaving securely, but barring that, we stress the importance of deploying spoofing prevention mechanisms, such as BCP38 and 84. These mechanisms theoretically could protect some of these attacks that we considered, though recent work shows that they're far from being adequately deployed. In 2021, DNSSEC validating resolvers are relatively few, but produce the majority of the traffic to AVROOT. This shows that DNSSEC deployment may be accelerating faster than the number of resolvers validating or not validating shows. And finally, security fixes take time. Thank you.